Welcome, everyone. We'll wait a couple of minutes to give some time for folks to join, and then we'll get into the presentation. Okay, so we just hit 100 in terms of our attendees, so we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to our presentation today, Leveraging ERGs to Influence Public Policy and Corporate Political Giving, presented by Pride at VMware. My name is Travis Croft. Next slide, please. There we are. My name is Travis Croft. My pronouns are he, him. I am one of the global co-leads for Pride at VMware.
I'm Michael Kennedy. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the Vice President of Global Government Relations and Public Policy for VMware.
And I'm Frances Fortunelli. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am the other global co-lead for Pride at VMware.
So for those of you that may not have heard of VMware, we're the biggest software company that you've never heard of. We sell infrastructure virtualization software and cloud services primarily to IT departments. And we're very excited to be speaking with you today. Thought we would start by just giving you some background or some context. So VMware, like any great tech company, comes up with its own acronyms for everything. So at VMware, we call our ERGs Power of Difference Communities, or pods. And before you start counting, we have 16 different location-based pods and 7 demographic pods. And basically, like any ERG or BRG, our goals are to drive representation for underrepresented communities, amplify the voice of our respective demographic groups, and foster an inclusive culture within VMware and the communities in which we do business. Next slide. I also thought it would be helpful in the context of this presentation, particularly, which is focused on influencing public policy and making sure that as companies are spending their PAC dollars in a way that is consistent with their values, I thought I would kick it off by sharing VMware's core values. We refer to them as EPIC 2 values: execution, passion, integrity, customers, and community. And I'm sure that wherever you work, your company, your employer has some version of these. And one of the catalysts for this presentation was a conversation about whether or not VMware as a company was living up to its values and the responsibility that we as ERG leaders and advocates for the LGBTQ plus community are holding our leaders accountable for walking the talk. So before we get into the meat of the presentation, I wanted you to ask yourself, how are the leaders in your company demonstrating their commitment to the LGBTQ community beyond pride parties and parades? How are they using their influence in public policy issues to advocate on behalf of their LGBTQ plus employees? And I want to leave you with that thought. I'm going to hand it over now to Michael, and he's going to talk about his role in shaping VMware's public policy goals.
Thanks, Travis. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to speak to this group. I know that from seeing some of the attendees, there are representatives from companies that have government relations functions that are much bigger than mine, and then some that may be a little bit smaller or non-existent. So just to set the table for what we do as a government relations team, we have about 25 people globally, And we kind of focus on these three areas of the three Ps: the public sector, kind of how we as a company intersect with government and government sales; policy impact, making sure that issues that affect us as a company and as a sector, we have a voice in there; and then political awareness, which is a nice way of saying that nobody's ever heard of VMware before. And so we try to make sure that politicians and policymakers understand who we are and our place in the firmament. Next slide talks about our deliverables and how we deliver within those areas. We try to impact the business and show ourselves to be, a profit center rather than just a cost center. We try to impact policy language and make sure that if policymakers gathering 10 companies around a table to talk about something, that VMware is part of that. We try to create thought leadership opportunities for our employees to be recognized as the brilliant people that they are, and have us be known as part of the solution in these issues, and rather than part of the problem. And then the fourth deliverable that plays into all of that, we try to deliver high-level, high-impact meetings that kind of go beyond just a Twitter opportunity for our executives, but actually kind of land with those three other priorities and deliverables. The next slide is a bit of an eye chart, but it kind of talks about one of the aspects that we use to be in this, and this is our Political Action Committee, or PAC. And PACs get a bad name because of super PACs and some of the shadowy kind of government or spending that happens around campaigns. But ours is an employee PAC, which is a heavily regulated political action committee that is constituted of kind of donations from our employees that have, federal limits on how much we can take in from any employee, including senior executives, and how much we can give out. But essentially, this slide kind of talks about the strategic value that I view in an analogy of, if you're going into a fight in a boxing ring, you kind of have the policy glove and you have the politics glove, and you really kind of have to be fighting with both of those sides. And policymakers will think about kind of the policies they're creating, and then they'll think about the politics behind it so that they can be reelected or maneuver in those things. And so we try to play in both of those arenas as well. And as part of that strategy, trying to be a strategic company in that, we play with a bipartisan and bicameral mandate, meaning that we interact with both the House and the Senate, and we interact with both Republicans and Democrats from a strategic value, and we try to engage as many people as possible through that. The next slide talks about kind of the size of corporate PACs within the larger giving firmament. And you can see the VMware PAC this is the last election cycle, so 2019 and 2020, leading up to the November elections in 2020. The VMware PAC is very small, and I think especially compared to some of the companies that are represented on this webinar. But even corporate PAC giving in general is a pretty small amount in the firmament of general kind of campaign funding that goes in there. And just to put the whole thing into context a little bit, 14.4 billion is what was spent on the last election cycle, so 19 and 20, including the presidential. It's a huge number, but to put that into context, in the same amount of time for 2019 and 2020, Americans spent $16.6 billion on Halloween. So costumes, candy, decorations, and party outstripped for Halloween itself more than the entire spending cycle for politics in general. One of the reasons that I'm an advocate for PACs and PAC participation and VMware's participation in this arena is that there has been academic studies that have shown that members who take PAC dollars tend to be less polarized and more kind of solution-oriented people. And you can see in the Axios box there that's covered. So we try to view ourselves as kind of a moderating, solution-oriented voice within that larger political firmament. But that's kind of where we have the PACs. Why do we do this, and why do we get there? Nobody says it better than Lin-Manuel Miranda. And so if you see from the next slide, quote from Hamilton, a lot of the time from the song that we all know and love, The Room Where It Happens, a lot of time corporations and other people look at Washington as this place where there's dysfunction and things are bad, and we never really know how decisions get made. But Miranda said it best that we just assume that it happens, but no one else is in the room where it happens. And for us, we try to remember that these members of Congress, these policymakers, are people, that they have to build relationships in their own way, And one thing that the PAC does, and talk about policy and politics, it puts us in some of those rooms where it happens. And so we will assume that if we're not in these rooms, our competitors, our peers will also be in those rooms, and they'll be shaping these conversations where other people will just be assuming that it happens. We try to be in those rooms, we try to do it, and we try to do it from an affirming and qualifying perspective rather than a disqualifying perspective, meaning that we try to look for reasons to support someone rather than reasons to disqualify someone from support. And an example for that for us would be like Senator Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma. He is a powerful member of the Armed Services Committee, which is an important factor for VMware and some of our participation with the government. We work with this committee to talk about how IT and our software can help those arenas, and we engage with him on those issues. At the same time, Inhofe is a climate change denier, and he's terrible on sustainability issues, where we're very, very vocal and forward-leaning on those issues. And so we engage and support Inhofe sometimes as the affirmative qualifying side of the Armed Services Committee, and in spite of the potentially disqualifying stance on the climate. So we try as much as possible to be positive, to be affirmative and affirming in trying to direct this spending.
All right, over to me. So as Michael mentioned, I know that we have a wide range of companies that are attending today, some of whom are much farther along in their journey, certainly have more mature ERG, BRG organizations. So I thought I would spend a minute and just talk about where VMware is on its journey. And I'm hoping that none of my colleagues from the Pride Pod are going to hold me accountable to these dates, because this is meant to be quick and general and not exactly precise. But the first Pride Pod, sort of formal Pride Pod, started in 2016 in our primarily our largest sites in the US, which are Atlanta, Austin, and Palo Alto. One of the things that I think pretty much sort of table stakes for showing a commitment to LGBTQ plus inclusion is the HRC's Corporate Equality Index. So we're happy to say that for the last 4 years, we've gotten a 100% rating, which is awesome. One of the things that we're proud of in terms of our international expansion is last year was the first year we participated in the India Workplace Equality Index, and we got a silver certification, and just submitted our application for this year, and we're determined to get gold. But those are things that we as companies can do, where we participate in a public forum to be able to demonstrate our commitments to the LGBT community. But as I said before, that's kind of table stakes, right? Attending events like this out in Equal, thank goodness that we have organizations that are as passionate as we are about DE&I. I was not there for the first session that we attended as a company, which I think was 2018. I got to attend in 2019, and honestly, it was life-changing. So I'm super excited to be able to participate, and this is my first time presenting. And from an organizational perspective, things that we're working on, that we're working towards, rolling out self-ID. I know this is a topic that we talked about a lot last year. A lot of organizations are rolling out self-ID. We rolled it out in the US and looking to roll it out internationally later this year or early next. And one milestone that we achieved this year that we're particularly proud of, a company of about 35,000 employees, we reached 1,000 members globally right at the end of Pride Month this year. So it was a great way to end Pride Month. But that's sort of where we are. And I think going back about 18 months, we had huge momentum going into 2020. We had really ambitious plans about the Pride celebrations that we were going to participate in as a company. And then COVID happened and pretty much changed everything. And everything that we had planned sort of went out the window. And I think it's something that all of us have had to deal with. And it had fundamentally changed the way that we live, the way that we work, and honestly, the way that we support each other. So at the same time that happened, we saw some really, huge cultural changes, cultural events, starting with the death of George Floyd and the rise in the Black Lives Matter movement, the increase in anti-AAPI hate, things that really sort of forced us to be introspective as a company, as a society, but particularly in the context of the pod, that we really didn't know how to process, how to support our peers in the Black pod, the Asian pod. And so one of the side effects, one of the outcomes of having to deal with that is it served as a catalyst for some intersectional collaboration. All of the demographic pods published statements of solidarity in support of the Asian pod, in support of the Black pod. And we held events that really were intended to encourage a dialogue. We had listening sessions with all employees. We had public statements from our CEO and our senior leadership. But this was the first time that we had really, as a company, tried to grapple with something like this. And fundamentally, it changed the way that we operate, the way that we do business. I would say that historically, VMware as a company had sort of a business first approach when tackling public policy issues, sort of hesitant to step into the political forum on things that were maybe didn't have a direct impact or visibility to the bottom line. And I think that over the course of the last 18 months, it became obvious that we couldn't sit on the sidelines anymore when it comes to these issues. I think more recently, the anti-trans legislation and the voting rights legislation that's making its way through state legislatures across the country rather. Those are issues that have an impact on all underrepresented communities, and we need to be speaking in one voice and speaking as one VMware in terms of supporting our communities and making sure that they're not subject to discrimination or restrictions on their ability to participate in the democratic process. So I guess, how do I wrap this up? We knew that we needed to be more vocal externally in our communities and honestly with our government officials so they can understand what we stand for as a company. And that's where the collaboration with Michael and the government relations team really came into play. And we made some changes that I think are really demonstrating that we're doing our best to live by the values that we espouse as a company and participate in public policy conversations and how we manage our political giving through the PAC. So Michael, I will hand it back to you.
Sure, thanks. And as Travis mentioned, we were looking for a while on how we shifted from this mentality of just shareholder value and shareholders to stakeholder value and stakeholders. And how did we approach public policy and VMware's positions on these things from purely business standpoint to a more of an employee, larger stakeholder standpoint that was more inclusive of a lot of these issues and a lot of the thought that is now expected, I think, from corporate America. And so the murder of George Floyd really precipitated that conversation for us. And part of that was we had a lot of employees who came forward afterward and said, the PAC is given to members of Congress who have an F rating from the NAACP. And, it was, we started having these conversations. Fortunately, or ironically, NAACP kind of made it a little bit easy on us in that every Republican received an F rating from them, even the Black members of Congress, Black Republicans, who just received Fs. So it became more partisan than it did about kind of Black members and Black issues from our perspective. But we started saying, okay, how do we address this? How do we adapt to this? And before that point, you can see on this slide that the three categories that we had for giving in the PAC were very limited. It was relevant to a committee sitting, a member of a committee that's relevant to our core business, candidate represented one of our home offices where we had a big presence, or they were in leadership on those sides. And those were our criteria by our bylaws. And so we were pretty limited in how we could give and we could do. So we came together and said, hey, why don't we change this? We're thinking about it, how we change it. So we added a fourth category that you'll see there that basically qualified giving only. The only qualification was basically aligning with our goals for 2030 and our values. And so it allowed us, again, to affirmatively come in and say, this member may be terrible on all of the business issues, but we really love their stance on LGBTQ plus issues. And so we want to be able to support them because of that, and because it's important to our people. And I saw in the chat, are there members who are, running anti-trans legislation or other things like that will be disqualified even though they may be pro-business? Again, we try to be qualifying rather than disqualifying. That said, we do put kind of everything up on the scales, and we try to weigh out where there are. And with pod members on our board now, we have now Travis's voice as part of that, saying, hey, listen, I don't really feel comfortable with that member, or I'd actually rather focus on these areas or things like that, where that can be part of that conversation. So what we did is we changed the bylaws to expand our ability to give based solely on our ERG issues. And then the next slide shows how we expanded our board. And if you look at the top line of this slide, that was our board before the murder of George Floyd. And it was mostly our C-suite executives plus me, and it was a very high level discussion from the C-suite of business issues. We expanded the board to include members of all of our global pods, the leaders. We included our DEI vice president, we included our chief people officer, and we expanded that voice. We basically doubled the size, we changed the diversity, we changed the level of executive in the conversation, so we had a better representation from across the company, and it changed the conversation completely, and it allowed us to get into a different level of conversation that changed, along with that, written bylaw changed the way that we look at how VMware is engaging with the PAC. The other question that I saw in the chat, and before I kick it back over to you, Travis, was, does the PAC do anything besides giving money? It's primarily the political action committee is organized around candidate giving, but we as a PAC do other things as well. We did a voting guide this last election where we did 50 states plus the territories of how people can register and vote. We brought in speakers to kind of talk about different issues, and we try to do kind of general political education, but the main activity around it is around the political giving. Go ahead, Travis.
Well, hey, so we just got a question for you, but I'm going to attempt to answer it. It was about, could you elaborate on the catalyst or the process through which the ERGs were able to make the business case to executive leadership to include social issues as a category for PAC giving? And I think you deserve the lion's share of the credit for initiating that conversation. But I also think it was because you had enough of different ERG leaders calling you, to talk about these issues and say, hey, we need to do something, we need to do something. And I think it was honestly through your initiative that that we had the opportunity now to have a seat at the table. So
well, and
I'll let you elaborate.
Right back at you, Travis, the credit right back at you, because where I was reacting to and when we created this initiative was in a reaction to the voice of employees who spoke up and said, we need this conversation, we need part of this. And so it was a reaction to the community and to the community that was starting to talk about these things. I also saw a question that talked about, how do you do it in a place where you're regulated by a conservative legislature, things like that. Again, from a strategic standpoint, it is important to be bicameral and to say, listen, we are going to engage with Democrats, or bicameral and bipartisan. We're going to engage with Democrats and Republicans. We may not agree with them on everything, but it's strategic for us as a company to be building relationships with with all of these kind of parties and everyone on both sides of the aisle, so that we can have as many conversations as we can and to be in as many rooms where it's happening as much as possible.
Hey, let's take a minute here and answer a couple of other questions that came in. Since you guys are doing such a great job of addressing these questions real time, I just want to make sure we go through a couple of other ones, and then Travis, will go back over to you. So another question that came in was, how does the LGBTQ plus pod at VMware feel about the PAC's support of legislatures who are vocally opposed to marriage equality? And at this person's company, they were hard pressed to get LGBTQ plus employees to support the corporate PAC when it supports people who oppose their rights.
Yeah, it's a super hard question and a super fair question. I think, one thing you have to kind of accept when going into a PAC and PAC participation is that there are going to be candidates that are going to be supported for that you don't like. And they're going to be done for different strategic reasons. And that most of those reasons are going to be business reasons that are relevant to what your core business is. I think that you can have a vocal stance to say, hey, listen, there are certain representatives that we find very problematic that we would like to have a discussion about, and we'd like to understand why the support is going in there. But I think the ability to put yourself in the shoes of the senior executives who are trying to get so much done for the company and represent their people, that they have to weigh everything in these balances in there and the pluses and minuses. And that's why, once again, we try to make our qualifications affirming rather than disqualifying, because given the 535 members of Congress and the hundreds of votes they're taking a year, I can find a reason to disqualify every single one of the 535 for something that is not great for VMware. And so once you start, disqualifying, that can become a slippery slope where you have nobody to qualify. And so again, we try to say this is affirming. And one of the great things about our bylaw change is that these ERG kind of values-based issues can be the sole purpose for affirming. And so they can be terrible on our business issues. But if Travis is passionate about that, we can say, great, we're going to support him, and we're going to sit down across from him and tell him the reason why you're getting a check from VMware is because of your stance on LGBTQ plus issues. And we want you to keep fighting like hell on those. We'll talk to you about these other issues another time, but this is the reason. And so I think that's a way to kind of be able to get in there and look at it as an affirmative way, and a way to start conversations with people who may disagree with you.
Mm-hmm. Hey, another question for you, Michael, is it says, when you say that employees join the PAC, is that something that employees contribute to money to themselves? I think you answered this earlier, but if you could please reiterate.
That's right. And there are tight federal rules around this, about who's eligible to join a PAC. You have to be a citizen or a green card holder. You have to be a certain level of your company or a stockholder, and the Federal Election Commission regulates that heavily, to the point where you can't just have a public PAC website. Our PAC website sits behind our single sign-on firewall, because only those who are eligible are allowed to kind of see it even and participate in it and be solicited. And so there are a lot of rules by that. But yes, by joining the PAC, it's basically putting some money into it.
Love it. Thank you. And obviously this is US. So
yes,
today VMware is not focused in other geographies.
Yeah,
well, actually,
countries.
No, Michael, I'll let you explain your charter, because we got a question about LATAM, and we haven't even talked about state and local.
I would view the PAC as one of the many tools in the toolbox of being able to interact with governments. And it's just a small tool, and sometimes it can be a hammer, but it's one tool. And so we engage with other, PACs are very US centric and US system centric, but we do engage on these issues internationally. It's tougher for us because it's harder to sometimes define what diversity means internationally in some of the countries where we're doing business. But we're trying to get better at that. We're trying to learn, and we try to engage. Oftentimes, we'll do it on our own. More often than not, we'll do it through trade associations and associative members we're in, where we can sign on to larger issues and show concerns that way with the entire industry. But we try to think about these kind of issues, ESG, DEI issues globally as much as we can. And part of the mantra that I try to have for us is that we as government relations try to be globally consistent and locally relevant. And so we can have these global values that Travis showed up there, but what do those mean in local relevance for different jurisdictions and where we're trying to move the needle?
Love it. Thank you. Excellent. So there's tons more questions, but let's keep going, and then we'll answer some of these at the end.
Great. Well, I think the next slide is going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that it's sometimes difficult to, or it's easy to speak in absolutes. So I think all of the changes that Michael talked about, and the expansion of the PAC board membership and the inclusion of the ERG leaders in the conversation, and our ability to influence where VMware focuses its attention from a public policy perspective, that set us up really well, unbeknownst to us, to respond to kind of major events like, for example, what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. So we talked about earlier, one of the things is, the CEO being visible. And so our CEO sent out a message the next morning about the events that happened at the Capitol and the importance of preserving our democratic process and an orderly transition of power. At the same time, we had a pod core team meeting that very morning, and we did not have as constructive a conversation about the events of January 6th. And in my capacity as a PAC member, PAC board member, and a pod leader, there was a lot of passion in the room, and I felt like I needed to respond to the note that the CEO sent out, and I copied Michael on it. And so I did think it might be a career limiting move because it was the first time I'd ever sent an email to our CEO directly, but basically conveyed the feelings from the Pride Pod were that we should immediately stop giving any PAC money to any of the members of Congress who had supported overturning the election results or had participated in any way in the insurrection. There may have been a couple of exclamation marks, maybe a couple of all caps in the email, I don't know, but I tried to be reasonable and constructive in the feedback. But I hit send, and almost immediately I got a response from the CEO acknowledging the email, thanking me for the input, and saying that he and Michael had a conversation scheduled for the next day, and that we would hear back. And so right away, that was the immediacy of the response. And Michael's response was much more thorough and considerate. And the net, I would say, is understand what you're asking. And the short answer is it's complicated. It's not a binary decision, but we do need to have a thoughtful conversation. And the immediate reaction, or the other immediate response, was that we suspended PAC giving until we could have that meaningful conversation and decide how we were going to move forward. And one of the outcomes of that conversation was a new framework for how we select PAC funding recipients. Michael's team puts together a proposal. They research candidates, as he said, that are affirming on issues that are important to the pods, whether it's the Asian pod, the Latino pod, the Black pod, the Pride pod. And we go through a decision-making process every quarter on who we're going to fund. And that's part of the new normal going forward. And so I have to say, for the folks like me who were initially skeptical of whether or not we were going to be able to have a meaningful impact on VMware's policy positions and how it spends money, I can honestly say that the response was immediate and was positive and receptive to the feedback. So I'll stop and I'll let you kind of, Michael, if you have any thoughts you want to add.
Sure, Francis, did you want to jump in with the question first, or?
Yeah, I did want to jump in with a question because somebody wanted to confirm that they understood. Does every person who is on this page get an equal vote in the PAC? That was a question that was asked earlier.
Yes.
And Michael, I think you answered it before, but just wanted to confirm that.
Yes.
Perfect.
And,
thank you.
It's on one side, being a new pod member on a board call with the entire C-suite can be intimidating. But what I love about our pods is that I think the people who rise to leadership, and the two people on the screen right now are not accepted in this, is that they rise to this leadership because they are passionate about these issues and they are not afraid to share their points of view on these issues. And so we've actually had terrific discussions around some of these issues that have been, very open and kind of illuminating, I think, for our executives as well, who I think are generally well dialed in and listening to the pods, even beyond the PAC sphere, especially beyond this PAC sphere. But I think, we don't have any shy or timid voices on that board at all.
That's for sure.
Again, what you can't see is there's a Teflon suit underneath Michael's jacket, and he wears that every time he goes into one of the pod meeting or the PAC meetings, because he knows he's going to get a lot of strong opinions.
Well, and listen, I'll take that with the next slide. For a while, because of the acts, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, the events of January 6th, for a while, and I think most of any other companies on here who have PACs, they would argue that the PAC juice was not worth the squeeze, right? And you got more grief for giving to almost anybody in Congress because the country has been so polarized politically, and the 2020 election in so many levels was polarizing and upsetting to people, and there was a reason for everybody in the country to get upset about something, it felt like. And so supporting a candidate anywhere seemed to be a kind of a minefield. And at some point it's like, well, is this worth it? Is it worth doing it? But I always go back to that, okay, room where it happens. And if we're not there, who's going to be there and who's going to be having these conversations if not us? And so one thing we thought of, and no one else was really doing this at the time, is listen, VMware has been attending a ton of these fundraisers that get organized by different groups or different companies or different fundraisers, and said, well, why don't we start organizing our own fundraisers around these issues? And we're going to make them only about the pod issues. And so we started out on a Zoom fundraiser with Senator Tammy Duckworth, you can see there, around AAPI issues. And we gathered a bunch of companies together. You can see some of the logos on the bottom right of the slide. And we said, hey, listen, we're going to come and talk to you another time, Senator Duckworth, about what we do as a software company and the cool things we're doing in businesses another time. But today we're here to talk to you about AAPI issues. And we're here to support you and give money to your campaign because you're fighting for these issues, because we as corporate America care about them and are doing things for our own communities, for the larger, broader community. And we want to support you and your candidacy because of these issues. And we're giving you this money to keep fighting like hell. And we want to tell you from the corporate America standpoint that we care about these issues and keep talking about them. And we've since done them. Travis flew out to Washington. We did a few of these events around LGBTQ+ issues. We've done them around Black issues, and we're going to continue to do them for all the pods. And it becomes a win-win-win in many ways. The members usually go to these fundraisers and they get bombarded about, what does the tax reform look like, or the privacy law, or what are you doing in this subcommittee or that thing? And it's usually very tactical policy discussions. For them to sit down and be able to talk about the issues that they are naturally passionate about and that they don't always get to talk about in these contexts, they light up and they get excited and say, yeah, we do that. And I'm going to be doing this more. And that's a great idea. And what do you think? And to learn what our companies are doing for our own communities is energizing for them. for people like Travis who come back, who can see kind of how the sausage is made and how these conversations can change, the perspectives about, oh, maybe corporate America isn't all just about dollars and cents, and they're about some of these issues, and so it gives ERG representatives an idea, kind of a glimpse behind the curtain of what happens in Washington. And then the last side is it gives our CEOs and our executives a tangible example of walking the talk, of putting our money where our mouths are, and to say, we're not just saying that we support these issues, we're actually investing in members of Congress who reflect these issues and our support of these issues. And so it is, no one has really been doing this in Washington. I think we're pretty new to this process and doing it. I hope it will grow. And we invite you, you can see some of the companies that have joined us. We invite you to encourage your companies to join the effort because, especially in these conversations, the more the merrier.
Hey, Francis, could you go back to the previous slide? Because there was another kind of section that I didn't get a chance to address. And I mean, I think one of the takeaways from this conversation is that we're trying to walk the talk, as Michael said. We're trying to really make sure that our values are represented in the way that we're engaging with members of Congress, but also discussions around influencing public policy. And again, we haven't even talked about kind of your global charter, Michael, and beyond the federal level, what you're trying to do or what your team is working on kind of at state and local for things like, the anti-trans legislation and the voting rights legislation that's making its way through different state legislatures. But, and it's not perfect. And I think, honestly, it was easy for me at the beginning of this journey to just take an extreme view. And in the early conversations, to some of the comments that folks have made in the chat, right? There isn't, I could tell you even before I went to my first PAC board meeting that there wasn't a single single Republican member of Congress that I would vote to endorse, right? Because of their company's overall record on LGBTQ plus issues or pick an issue, right? So, but the very kind of, it's easy to take that kind of absolute view and say, nope, I'm not going to participate, versus the structure itself is intended to be bipartisan, bicameral. So you have to, and this is not something that happens today anywhere. You have to try to meet in the middle, right? And, members of Congress, senators, like they change. Different parties get elected. And if you only say you're going to do business with one party, you're cutting yourself out of half the conversation. So I know this is more your wheelhouse, Michael, but I just wanted to share kind of my personal perspective on some of the comments that were coming through on the chat. But the other thing that I want to make sure I talk about, and that I think is as important to me as a pod leader, is VMware taking public positions on some of these important policy issues. And these are issues where organizations like HRC and Out and Equal are fighting the fight every day. They're out there advocating. And what are we doing to add our voices to that conversation? So I mentioned earlier that historically VMware does not have a record of signing on to these kind of public pronouncements. Other companies, like many Silicon Valley companies, are very vocal, and sort of we're catching up. But things that I'm really, really proud of in terms of kind of the new model and the success that we're having for these three, the Business Coalition for the Equality Act, the business statement against anti-trans legislation, and the Business for Voting Rights open letter. These requests all came from members of our pod, and we raised them with Michael. And invariably, the term he uses, he ran the traps, right? But invariably, the response was yes, and usually within 24 hours. So it wasn't just the fact that we got our leadership to sign on, but that it was a no-brainer. It was like, yes, this is the right thing to do. So I would, for the folks that are on the phone who are representing, the LGBTQ plus voices within their company, if your company has a government relations team and you haven't already established a relationship with them, these are things that are out there that you can sign on to that are a tangible way for your company to demonstrate their commitment to the community, and they're just good for business. I can't imagine that there's a company anywhere that wouldn't think that this is something that they should sign on to. But I know not every company is the same, not every organization is the same. But I just wanted to make sure we came back to that, because at the end of the slide, at the end of the presentation, we've included a list of these resources that anybody can leverage to try to advance these issues within their own companies. And so I want to make sure I give you guys a heads up so that we can talk about it at the end. But I don't know,
Travis,
Michael, if you had anything you wanted to add.
You mentioned about holding candidates accountable. There was a question around how do we do that? So did we pull funding from some members who were involved in the insurrection, and what was the outcome from that?
Yeah, certainly that happened. And again, we try to be affirming rather than disqualifying in the things that we do. But I saw Nikki had a question too about, were there candidates who started receiving donations rather than or stopped receiving them? Certainly. And I think an example of that is on slide 15 before we jump to 16, and Travis, and I know we're running out of time here, is Richie Torres, for example, who is terrific on LGBTQ plus issues, is one of the, I think he claimed to be the only Afro-Latino LGBTQ member of Congress, and we sat down with him for a while and supported him, and he was not on the radar screen for us at all before we kind of sat down with Travis and the pods and started saying, okay, here are some members that we could support, and so it was, I think we've definitely broadened our perspectives in these. We as a government relations team try to kind of plan some of the giving criteria early on, and we bring them to the board so that we're not forcing the board to do a lot of homework, but we do sit down with the pods in part of that process and say, hey, who do you care about? Are there members that you're viewing? Are you are you flagging any certain members? Are there other issues we want to be paying attention to? And we try to respond to that, especially kind of on the affirmative side.
Okay, well, I guess we should go to the next slide. I think part of the theme of this is sort of finding your voice. And certainly I can tell you that you don't need to have all the answers. I guess the most important takeaway for me was the value of kind of patience and persistence, right? You have to, if something is important to you or the members of your pod, then you should not be afraid to speak up. And I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes just sort of talking about the resources that you have available to you, right? So I'm fortunate in that some of the members of my pod or my ERG are particularly passionate and active, in their local politics. And so they were a great resource to me and to Francis and kind of educating us and connecting us with Michael and his team. I mentioned that a lot of these issues that we're dealing with are intersectional. So there's a lot more communication and collaboration with the other members of the ERGs, the other ERG leaders within VMware. But you have your professional network, and I know I'm a member of a Silicon Valley ERG Alliance, which has Pride ERG leaders from a bunch of different companies, I think 50 different companies. And we meet once a month and talk about issues that are important. And I get the benefit of their experience and insight. And I know some of them are at Summit. I don't know if some of them are on this session or not, but they're a great resource. And then again, you've got groups like the HRC, the NGLCC, Out and Equal are wonderful hosts, and industry or trade associations that Michael referred to, right? And all of them are available, and you shouldn't be afraid to reach out. Let's see.
Hold on, there was a really provocative question around Lindsey Graham, and that VMware has given 9,000 between 2019 and 2020. And I just wanted to reaffirm what Michael has been sharing throughout the presentation, that we are always going for affirming rather than disqualifying. If we disqualified, again, we probably wouldn't have anybody to give money to. So thank you for that question, appreciate it. There was one other question that I think is a good one, which is outside of signing the Business Coalition for the Equality Act, what more can we ask corporations to do to get it passed?
Vote. I mean, I think it's going to be hard to pass in this Congress right now, and I think, you know, changing members may impact that. I also think, you know, like Travis said, sometimes compromise is going to be necessary in some of these things, and so in order to get other members on board, having other issues on ideas on how to do it and how to get there. You know, several years ago, the Senate passed in a bipartisan fashion the Employee Non-Discrimination Act, and that enjoyed some bipartisan support. And so I think there can be common ground found, and a lot of these issues get hyper politicized, and sometimes members will oppose them for, you know, the wrong reasons because of politics rather than policy. And so I think focusing on the policy aspects of it and the education around the policy side rather than the political fights, and that is also important. It's hard, and passing anything in Washington is hard. But I do think continuing to engage and getting your own employee resource groups to engage your government relations teams to say, hey, listen, these are important, and we'd like to, you know what we can be doing to tell members of Congress that our companies care about it.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is something we can share. Do we have a feel for percentage of the PAC funds that go towards social issues versus more traditional business issues like tax and trade?
Yeah, so right now it's about a quarter, discreetly than that kind of side, where, you know, we have those kind of 4 giving criteria, and we generally divide up those giving criteria in fourths. It's not a hard, fast rule, but that's generally where it's gone. We probably, this year, will probably maybe over-rotate a little bit more on some of these values-based criteria, but generally it will be a quarter. And, you know, for me, that also could be a win-win, because Travis and Francis can go back and say, hey, listen, if we want to be doing more of these things, we need to grow the PAC. And because, you know, some of your company's PACs may be enormous, and you may be able to kind of give a lot of money to some of these things. Ours, as you saw from that previous slide, is not enormous. And so when you look at a quarter, that ends up being $25,000 a year, approximately. And when you divide that up amongst the 7 pods, it's not a ton of money, right? And so that's an incentive for us all to kind of think about, how do we grow the PAC so that we can continue to grow the pie and keep spreading those dollars around.
Thank you for that.
So this, we've already kind of been into this a little bit about how do we, you know, how do you get the PAC to lead from these things? Travis talked about running the traps, and I think that may be a Washington term. I don't know if it's that goal, but it is this kind of idea of, you know, when a bill gets introduced, you run the traps on a bill to make sure, you know, who's going to like it, who's going to hate it, where are the risks, where's the support. And I think, you know, for ERGs to be really good citizens in this process, it is talking about the risks in addition to the positives, the benefits. And I think any kind of lobbyist worth, you know, their salt is going to go and approach an issue and say, hey, here's why we're for it, and here's, you know, the other people who may be against it, and let me tell you why those against it, you know, issues can be mitigated. But to pretend that nobody's against it, members won't trust you very soon. And I think that's true inside a company as well, that kind of recognize the risks and reward of anything that people are signing on for. And so I think, but the ability for your GR team to quickly interface with the C-suite, because they're usually doing it on a lot of issues like this, and say, hey, listen, this seems to be consistent with our values, consistent with our previous positions, and we're in good company with these other entities signing on to a letter. You can usually get a quick response to sign on to issues. And as Travis mentioned, we've been pretty effective at that of late. I think signing on to these letters, I would say don't just do them. Ask first and make sure you're not signing your company's name without approval from the company. But I think, part of the issue is that the GR team, there are 1,000 issues that I'm trying to monitor globally. And so sometimes the issue that your ERG group will be zeroed in on, it won't be on my radar. And so a lot of these letters that we've signed on to have been brought to me through the pods. And I've then been able to say, hey, great, I love the idea of signing on to this. Let me go run the drafts. And so we go do that. So be vocal and bring those forward. I think getting your ERG groups on your PAC board or in a government relations advisory position in some way is really important. And maybe the board membership is locked by bylaws, but you can also, I've seen a lot of other companies create advisory boards that kind of sit next to the actual official board, and they tend to meet more often, be a little more vocal, and sometimes have some more open conversations because you don't have the intimidation of the CEO kind of saying, well, this is what I want and you better get in line type stuff, which doesn't really happen at VMware, but I think there's a potential for that. I think the other side is, the bylaw discussion that, these things are not fixed in stone, and that, yes, you have to have a lawyer look at them and make sure that they're, you're being compliant and all that. But I think getting that into there, and then also just welcoming these policy discussions and talking about why these things are important to the community, and starting that dialogue with your government affairs groups or your public policy groups, and making sure that that's there. So I think those are the things that you can do to lead, not just with the PAC, but with government relations in general.
Awesome. So these are the links that we'll make available. I assume we're going to load the slides into the portal so you can download. But basically, these are things that you can use to educate yourself or to educate your leadership on some of these issues. Obviously, the two that I mentioned at the top, the Corporate Equality Index, many of you are probably already participating. If you have a large presence in India, highly recommend looking into the India Workplace Equality Index. The next few are some of the open letters that your companies may already have signed, or you may want to get them to sign as a tangible, visible commitment to you supporting the LGBTQ plus community and frankly, other underrepresented demographics as well. The UN Free and Equal Standards of Conduct for Business, the Partnership for Global LGBTI Equality, those are more globally focused, less US centric, but same sort of general principle around how we support equality for the LGBTQI community globally. I have to give a plug for the Gender Cool Project. They're advocating on behalf of the transgender community, specifically supporting transgender youth. It just so happens that we have a couple of parents at the company who are members of our pod who are transgender, who have transgender kids who are Gender Cool champions. And they're also very active in educating and advocating for the transgender community. So definitely
trans and non-binary.
Trans and non-binary, thank you. And then I saw it in the chat. Open Secrets is an interesting website. If your company does have a PAC and you want to see where they're spending their money, this organization is committed to transparency, and all of the information is publicly available, as I know a couple of folks have already contributed to the chat. But if you have never checked it out, recommend it as well. So I think that's it. And we have literally like a minute and a half left.
We have one question I think we can answer. Do we have any tips for dealing with a government affairs group and senior leadership team that refuses to sign on to open letters? What's a good way around that?
Great question. I don't know. And, VMware has been on its own journey with that, and we didn't do them for a while. And it was, we try to stay under the radar and all those kind of things. I think there are ways that, you can be impactful without having to sign on to open letters. The open letters kind of show very openly a position, but I think you can also be impactful without signing on to every letter. And I think you also want to appreciate that your C-suite is not going to swing at every pitch, and that they're going to take some and say, you know, we're going to take a pass on that. And we've had a couple examples with that. And so I think continuing to demonstrate the value to the greater community and to the business, and to make a business case for it, I think is the best way to kind of break that ice if you can. But some companies just don't do it. But it doesn't mean you can't engage.
That's true.
We go to the last slide because I want to make sure that
Oh, yeah.
for folks.
Apologies.
No worries. So this is our contact info. So clearly this isn't a topic that we're passionate about, and that we're lucky to have Michael's support. If you want to reach out to us or have any questions or continue the conversation, there's our contact info. We would love to support you. So any parting words, Michael or Francis?
Thanks for the opportunity. It's been an honor.
Thank you for asking your questions. And hopefully this session gave you some good insights in terms of how VMware handles controversial candidates or members of Congress. So thank you very much. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you.